Today's session is about your role as a leader. Tiger McLuhan, one of the co-authors of this curriculum series, is famous for describing ministry leadership in this way. Leadership, it's not about you, and it's about you. And he's right. So the first element I want to highlight about your role as a leader is that it's not about you, it's about God. Leadership in a ministry context is primarily about what God's up to and how God works through ordinary people and situations to do extraordinary things. Think for a moment about some of the most impactful leaders of the Bible, people like Abraham and Moses and David in the Old Testament, or Peter and Paul and Timothy in the New Testament. If it were about them and their abilities or their faithfulness or intellect, God's work in the world would have been hampered. But it wasn't about them. It was about God. Servant leadership is different than other leadership models. One of the core differences is that servant leaders seek to serve the master's work or their mission. In the case of servant leadership in ministry, leaders serve God and God's mission in the world. And God's deepest desire is to be in relationship with all of creation so that they may have life and have it abundantly. God's work then is about fostering abundant life. How? Primarily through relationships. People with God and people with one another. We as leaders both participate in helping foster such relationships and to attend to our own relationship with God. And keeping these two in balance can be hard. But remembering that God's bigger than any one of us is key. A second key element of your role as a leader is that it's about discipleship. To unpack this, let's look at the text that you just read. There are so many things that could be lifted out of these verses in John's Gospel. But within our conversation today, let's lift out two. First, Jesus is speaking primarily to Peter. If you remember from the larger story, it wasn't that long before this story that Jesus predicted that Peter would betray Jesus 3 times the night he was arrested. And indeed, in spite of the fact that Peter disagreed with him, Peter did betray him 3 times. And this encounter comes on the other side of that reality. Jesus knows that Peter betrayed him, and he doesn't worry about it. He knows his sin, and rather than confront him, he asks him a relational question. Do you love me? That seems to be the core out of which a leader is to operate. It's not just Peter that's asked this question, but so are all of us, leaders in the church today. A second thing to highlight is that once Peter responds, Jesus gives him work to do, or orders, feed my lambs. But what does that mean? Tend to my people, tend to my world, share my love with those around you. So not only is everyone asked if they love Jesus, but then all are invited to join in God's work, invited to be part of this relational work that's centered out of our love for God, and out of that love, we love one another. Remember the second part of Tiger's phrase, it's about you? This third element that's important about your role as a leader is that leadership is active and involves doing particular things, or in other words, involves you. Looking back on our text from John, it's great to be asked, feed my lambs, but what does that mean? How do we feed God's lambs? Well, that's a great question. Leading in Jesus' day and in ours is complex and multifaceted. But for our conversations today, I'd like to suggest 3 groups of skills or practices that servant leaders need if they're going to tend to as they feed God's lambs. First, administrative gifts and practices. These gifts include things like planning and organizing God-centered ministry. It's about implementing ministry that fosters discipleships and helps people discover a Christian way of life. It's tending to logistics of ministry so that people are free to be in relationship and learn and grow and serve together. And it's about creating a safe environment for those relationships to grow not only with God, but with one another. For those of you that want to learn more about these gifts or explore them further, we have other sessions that will address them on strategic planning and planning for the unexpected. Second, communication and interpersonal gifts and practices. These gifts include things like learning how to read one's situation within ministry and discovering what it means to feed God's lambs in that time and place. It's interpersonal skills and relating with people one-on-one and in various types of groups, be they large or small. And it's developing and carrying out a communication strategy to share what's happening, not only with the leaders and youth, but also with their families. For more on these, you can see the sessions on leading small groups and faith conversations. And finally, our third group is ministry gifts and practices. These gifts include things like tending to one's own journey of faith, nurturing and leading discipleship practices for young people, things like Bible studies and prayer and worship and service. And it's about helping others discover their own giftedness and then creating opportunities for them to use those gifts. It's about creating, finally, practices to reflect on these ministry activities and asking how do they relate to nurturing faith and a life of discipleship. Resources for this area are plentiful, and the website has a lot of them listed if you want to explore them in more detail.